So our talk today is on the third Oxfording picture, Seeing the Ox. And we have a few faces I haven't seen for a few weeks. So just to put us in context here, I'm doing a 10-week series of talks on the Oxfording pictures, which is a famous Zen expression of the stages of spiritual development. So it starts off with seeking the ox, being in a state of confusion and lostness and wanting to understand our true nature so that we can make sense of the world, make sense of ourselves, make sense of our own experience, make sense of our own suffering, primarily, which is always what drives one to a spiritual path. To understand that. It's what drove Buddha to his spiritual path. It's to these questions about why did we suffer? Illness, old age, and death, and then also birth, the pains and suffering that we all experience just by the nature of being human. What's going on with that? And he looked deeply into himself in specific ways, using specific practices that he brought to bear on that investigation, and he was able to transform his own experience of suffering into a deep wisdom around how that's created. And he was able to discover that actually our true nature is intrinsically free, intrinsically one with all of creation. We're always interdependent on all beings, and we're always in the flow, if you will, of all of creation. And it's only a false notion of us being separate and us being fixed that creates that suffering. It's that false sense of fixity that we impose. But he saw how deeply embedded that false sense was in our subconsciousness. He didn't have a word for the subconscious in a way. We kind of have that clear sort of unconscious, subconscious. But he was able to see that there's various levels of consciousness, most of them being below the level of conscious awareness. And it was that subconscious fixation that we had of a false sense that really was at the root of all of our suffering. So the path is one of embarking on an investigation inside to see what is at the root of our self-understanding, and then seeing it and getting more familiar with it, and then inhabiting it and realizing it, bringing it alive. So this true nature, which in Zen we also call no self. True self is no self. And true nature is this thing. It's not a thing. It's a nature that we can nevertheless not quite put our fingers on, can't quite describe in words. It's mysterious, ultimately, but it is a mystery that we can become more intimate with, fully intimate with. Oxfording 3 is seeing the ox. So we get a glimpse. I have two versions of the verse. One goes, among willow branches swaying in the spring breeze, an oriole is singing. How can the sparrow experience his joy in calling for his mate? Isn't the moonlight glimmering in the forest my home? Then another version is, the song of the yellow oriole echoes in the forest. Warm sun, gentle breeze, willows green along the shore. The ox has no place to turn in the brambles. Quite different translations of that last line. The first one is, isn't the moonlight glimmering in the forest my home? And the other one is, the ox has no place to turn in the brambles. Yeah. The pictures for this one are almost universally the picture of the rump of an ox and without the head. So you just see the backside of the ox. You get a partial glimpse of the ox and it's just the backside. So I like looking at the emotional tone qualities that are presented on each of the stages, because these aren't intellectual stages, they're actually body-mind stages, body-mind experiences. So in the first one, you might remember our emotional tone quality was one of desperation, confusion, and lostness. The second one last week was one of adventure and great highly activated curiosity that got engaged. And then this one, what I find in it is a peacefulness, a relief, and then there's also a sense of inquisitiveness that's going along, investigation of this place, and somehow, that's it. That's it. So it's not the final resting place by any means, but it's a clear view of what you recognize as home in a spiritual sense. And now your belief that that spiritual home exists is validated because you see it. And it is a partial glimpse. Like I said, it's just the rump in most of the pictures of this. It's a partial glimpse. In fact, at this stage, we might not even be sure about what we're seeing. The real detail shape of it. We know this is it, but in the metaphor, is it a horse? Is it a dragon? Is it a shape in the rocks? We're not quite sure. We know that this is it. We can sense the specialness that we tap into when we get this glimpse into our true nature. But we don't necessarily have a real fine-grained view of what it is. But it's undeniable that we're seeing what we're looking for. This kind of metaphor of like you see, you partially see and sort of partially recognize your true nature, understood as, you can't quite make out this animal. It's the same metaphor that Yasutani Roshi uses in the 3 pillars of Zen. And I'm sure many of you have looked at the 3 pillars of Zen as kind of an introduction to Zen practice. And I use it in my Naropa class as well, because it really does give a lot of core teachings about Zen and that. And Yasutani says, specifically when he's talking about Kensho, which is our first big breakthrough experience and really seeing that we're not who we think we are, that you really aren't the me story that you believed for however many years. Clear understanding and sight of that. And he says some people's kenshos are bigger than others, right? Some people might see, it's like seeing a cow from, 100 yards away or even a mile away. And you're pretty sure it's a cow, but you're not quite sure, how big it is or the patterns on its skin or the shape of its head, the lineaments of it. Whereas somebody who's right up to the cow, can see all those things in detail, very close to it. So these Kensho experiences are like that too. Some of them are from more distant, and some of them are closer up. And at this stage, there's that variability in how much you see. So in this experience of dropping away, when it becomes undeniable to you, at least in this moment, that you're not who you have believed yourself to be all this time, it's undeniable that that is just a story that you've overlaid and that you, like a sleepwalker, kind of come to believe that dream. Yeah, which we all do. Now it's become undeniable. I'm sleeping when I believe that. Your whole experience of your senses actually starts to shift. As you carry that forward, you see that your senses even can merge in a way. And I know some of you have quite an experience of having your senses kind of merge and not having a clear distinction between them. Seeing and hearing and thinking, feeling, you know, you kind of find them connected in a way. So what we're doing here when we see the ox is we're actually directly perceiving reality. And this is what we call prajna wisdom. This is a view that's a non-conceptual view, non-intellectual. All conceptual thought, you recognize as an overlay over this experience because you can't put words to it. Words are the form of conceptual thought. You can't put words to it, and nevertheless, you are directly perceiving this nature. So it's helpful to realize that what brings us to this view, this clear seeing of ourself, is a persistence of attention. Okay? I've said it, a lot in the last 6 months, is that this all starts with the continuity of your attention on something. Continuity leads to concentration, leads to absorption, leads to unification. And this is that first real experience of the unification place, when you see that the false sense of the self was really the only obstacle that was keeping you from seeing that you're actually one with everything. And that falls away. But it does always start with this continuity of attention. And you can even, potentially kind of just by looking deeply into, say, a flower, how often have you spent, say 20 minutes just staring at a flower, or a tree, or a cloud, just with non-judgmental awareness, just looking at it. If you spend that type of attention with anything, stone, you'll see that your own sense of what that thing is shifts dramatically. Okay? You look at a tree long enough with that kind of non-conceptual, non-labeling attention, it can really emerge to you in its true nature as like a, say a vein, connecting the sky and the earth in this greater organism. It's something that's an inner part of a greater organic whole, instead of a thing that's separate in a kind of external relationship with other things. Look at a tree long enough and you can see that. It's completely inseparable from the sky, from the earth. It's a dramatically different way of experiencing things. And in the same way, when we spend that type of attention inside into what's going on with ourself, we see that what's going on is completely dependent upon so much else that is going on and that has gone on in the past. It's all interdependent, it's all highly conditioned. All of your experiences are highly conditioned. Your sense of yourself shifts dramatically. You're not an independent automaton, moving through an external environment. You also are not a separate thing. So this is the experiential validation of your intellectual understanding of yourself and interdependence. Probably everybody in here has a notion of what that means, the vision of it, a view of it. But that view, that vision, that image, and concept, isn't it. It doesn't touch it. You need it to be experientially validated. And in that experiential validation, then there becomes greater freedom and spontaneity. because of the self-protective charge that is being enlisted in the service of that independent self-sense, it starts to dissipate. It just doesn't, it's not needed in the body-mind system. Now, I talk about the kind of the risks and the perils of each stage. There's perils. In the last stage, there was the peril of sort of losing faith, losing your confidence as you're, you see the footprints, you see the tracks of the, I'm sorry. That's my phone. Yeah.
Sounds like a trap.
It's a,
like an alien is sending you a message.
Yeah.
Instead of a visual track, it's an.
Yeah, it came in right at that time, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a theremin from the old science fiction, right? It's what I have as my ringer. And there's only one person who can come through when I have it turned off. That's.
Yep.
Yes, okay, all right. So she was probably leaving the message. Yeah, the tracks are everywhere. Right. But when we only see the tracks and we don't see the actual thing, the risk is like, really? Is it really at the other end of these tracks? Is that going in? So you can lose confidence at that stage. And that's a risk in that previous stage. In this stage, the peril is that then we start to over-intellectualize this experience that we've had. Right? So we do have a good, solid experiential validation of yourself, but now it's really easy. In fact, it's almost impossible not to have, oh, this is what just happened. This is how it is. I don't have a separate self. I'm all interconnected like this, right? And it becomes an image in a sense. I actually did this a lot early in my practice. I'd get some understandings and I'd have some big experiences, and I would always go into like philosophizing, intellectualizing them, and make a story out of it. Early in my practice, in fact, even before I started practice, I was into literary theory, and I was prone to philosophizing a lot. So I was in graduate school in English literature in the 80s, and so we studied things like Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault, and some English teachers and poets over here who are nodding their heads vigorously. Some of you may have read this stuff. I really grooved on that, which in those philosophical systems, they really look at the way we create reality through our intellectual, conceptual polarities that we kind of build, and even those philosophers pointed back to mystical thinkers like Meister Eckhart and the Anti-Dionysus, and talk about mystical teaching, saying we can't, that the deepest truth is beyond thought, beyond intellectualization. So I thought I really understood Derrida, and then I would philosophize about that. But that philosophizing in itself doesn't really get at it. It's just spinning some new concepts around it. Okay. The Tao Te Ching says the first line, right? The way that can be spoken is not the true way. So I would just caution you about doing that. I did it more than, well, I did it as much as I needed to, I guess. But if you find yourself doing that, creating these kind of elaborate visualizations and theories and models and understandings around no self, you're really just pulling yourself away from yourself. That's why Zen masters are always just whacking you on the head. Okay, enough of that. And fortunately for me, I had the teachings that pointed that to me. No, it's not that. But I also had teachers who could say, nope, that's not it. That's not it. That's not it. Oh my God, if I ever brought anything like that to either of my teachers, it was just like, cut it out, get out of here, stop, enough with that. Never, not one bit would they put up with that. And I do that with my students too. That's my role, is to not, entertain that kind of thinking, because it just takes you farther away from it. My teacher Shinko Roshi said, in another context, she said, in Zen we only talk about our experience. And this really resonated with me. And this even applies to Zen, I think, in contrast to some other Buddhist, sects and practices too. Sometimes there's much more of a kind of scriptural, debate, forms of debate and forms of scriptural analysis, and kind of debating even the content of a body of teachings, different types of Buddhism. And it's not always talking about one's experience, it's talking about one's conceptual understanding. And Zen, we only talk about our experience. So all of the sacred texts that come from Buddhism are just teachers talking about their own experience and then responding to students who are sharing their understanding. But if they're not talking about their experience, they're just going to get, brought down to earth, to the ground of the Dharma. And the ground of the Dharma is personal experience of self, of yourself. And true self is no self. And that's the pointer to how not to intellectualize this glimpse of true self that we have. It's to come to our grounded experience, come to our sense reality, our sensory experience, come to our body, come to our hearing, come to our vision, come to the smells, come to the tastes, return to that nature, what arises in the body and the mind from this moment experience. Continually come to what we call first order sensory experience. The oriole is singing. The sparrow experiences joy in calling to his mate. Isn't the moonlight glimmering in the forest my home? Warm sun, gentle breeze, willows green along the shore.